Hello once again, friends, neighbors, fellow Christians. Welcome back to our ministry here at What the Bible Says. And welcome back to another video lesson in this series where we are debunking the typical objections that are raised against the fulfilled paradigm, and even a few that are not quite so typical. In fact, they are quite unique. And I've got a couple of those. We've considered one already in the previous video, and I've got another one to share with you in just a little bit as we go through our lesson. And so these are some objections. Many of them are typical that are being presented by Miss Barbara Vannah. And again, a couple of them are they are specifically unique to her, which is why that we are focusing this short section of this series of debunking typical objections specifically to her, and because of how she has consistently, month after month after many months, just totally ignored my arguments, although I made a little bit of progress with one, and we'll talk about that also as things go on. And that is, well, I'll just go ahead and tell you, that is her admission when I asked her the question on verse 2, Matthew 24:2, where Jesus said every stone of the temple will be thrown down, right? All right, she says that is AD 70, and then the rest of the discourse is future. And that's the first of her unique objections and postulations, assumptions. But I said, okay, we actually agree on verse 2 that every stone of the temple being thrown down, that's obviously the destruction of the temple in AD 70. So we agree on that. And I said, so you have to also agree that in Luke 19:43 and following, where Jesus wept over the city, and he made the same statement that not one stone will be left on another, but he is drawing that from Isaiah chapter 25, 26, and 29, an inclusio there, the little apocalypse, and that Jesus is drawing directly from specifically Isaiah 25 and verse 12, chapter 26 and verse 5, and chapter 29 verses 2 through 4. And so it's the same sentiment that is reiterated in all three places. And so in this block of prophecy then of Isaiah 24 through 29, the little apocalypse, then we have, okay, so she has admitted and agreed that the Luke 19:43 and following, that is AD 70. So that is fatal to her position. She just doesn't know it yet, and she's ignoring my arguments on that fact. So that is taken from Isaiah 25, 26, and 29. And so within this block of prophecy, you have the resurrection, you have together with my dead body, they'll rise, right? He'll swallow up death and victory, right? Isaiah 25:8 that Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 54. And you have the destruction of the altar, which is AD 70. But you also have the great trumpet in chapter 27. And so this is the source for Jesus, his statement in Matthew 24:31, that he'll send his angels with the great sound of a trumpet, and they'll gather together his elect from the four winds, right? And so we have these elements, if you will, the constituent elements within the little apocalypse, and that is tied directly to Luke 19, that Miss Barbara admits is AD 70. And so, again, that is fatal to her position of the dual prophecy, which we'll talk about here in just a minute, or will, that she applies to Matthew 24 and the Olivet Discourse, Mark's record as well as Luke's record. And so I want to show you something. We'll go down here and look at this. And so I want you to notice here, Matthew 2, now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king. All right, so we have a timeline beginning here in the narrative of Matthew. And so you have the birth of Jesus, right, in Bethlehem of Judea. And then after the birth of Jesus, right, so then we have verse 7. And I'm not going to take time to read all of these verses. You can do that on your own time. I encourage you to do that. Read all of these, read this chapter. But I just want to point out, make a few points here, and to make an argument here. And so then Herod, when he secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. All right. And then in verse 11, when they... And that's when the wise men came, and it says when they had come into the house. Now notice that they didn't come to the manger because of where Mary laid baby Jesus, because there was no room in the inn. All right, you see that? So when they were coming into the house, and then if we skip down to verse 16, then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem, in all its districts from 2 years old and under, according, now notice this, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. All right, so you have this timeline in this narrative of Matthew, beginning with the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem of Judea, up to the time when Herod murdered all of these little children. How awful that was. But I want you to notice the time frame, the time gap, the time coverage, all right, that we see in this narrative of Matthew. All right, now let's go on. All right, now here in Luke chapter 2, I want you to notice, of course, this is obvious, it's talking about Jesus. The child grew and became strong in the Spirit, okay? His parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. All right, now, do you see that there? I'm going to make a point here, but I want you to hang on to these examples now. In verse 41, his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of Passover, right? And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. What feast, folks? How would anybody know what feast this is referring to in verse 42 if it was not named in verse 41? You see, my point is there has to be an antecedent to this. The feast. Which feast? The feast of the Passover. But see, here's the point. There's a 12-year gap, approximately 12-year gap, between verse 41 and verse 42. You see that? You see that in the narrative? All right, let's look at another one. All right, we have here in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus selected his 12 soon-to-be apostles. All right, and Matthew even calls them the 12 apostles right here because he's writing some 25 to 30 years after the fact. All right. And so they are named here in these verses. But I want you to notice in particular verse 4. Simon the Canaanite and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Now, do you see that? So you see, even in this narrative, even within this one verse, there is an approximate 3-year gap and a change of location. Again, within just this one verse, because it was about 3 years and a change of location from when they were here on this mountain near Capernaum to when Judas betrayed the Lord as they were coming out of the Garden of Gethsemane. Do you see that? So again, in this narrative, there's an approximate 3-year gap and a change of location just within this one verse. All right, one more. Let's bear with me here. Let's look at one more. All right, here in Acts 11:28, we read, "Then one of them named Agabus stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout all the world, which also happened in the days of Claudius Caesar." All right, again, there's several years past, of time just within this one verse in this narrative. Do you see that? I mean, any of us who can see through a ladder understands the concept that the writer, Luke, was writing these things well after the fact. And he's following this narrative. Agabus made this prophecy, this prediction, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. Okay, so when we come to the Olivet Discourse, and in Matthew's record, Jesus told his disciples, "See not all these built." In Mark's record, they were looking at the temple buildings, and he made the declaration that the day was coming when there would not be left one stone upon another. Now, Miss Barbara's argument is that was AD 70. Obviously, we agree on that. But because Jesus went out of the temple, he left the Temple Mount and he went over to the Mount of Olives, which one of the writers says over against. It was directly across from the temple. Peter, James, John, and Andrew came there to him, then asked him these questions. Okay, so her argument is because of a change of location and because a little bit of time anyway, a little bit of change in time, then it's a different, because of a different location and a little bit different time, then it's a different subject. That's how she wiggles in the idea of dual prophecy. But again, when you follow the narrative, just like these 4 examples that I've given you, all of these were written long after they took place. And so the writers would write down this story, this narrative of how these events took place. Kind of like in Acts chapter 11, when Peter rehearsed the matter from the beginning in chronological order, in sequential order. And what I'm getting at is there is no grammatical nor contextual basis to divorce verse 3, Matthew 24:3, when shall these things be, from Jesus saying, not be left one stone upon another. You see, again, there has to be an antecedent. In Mark's record, Jesus answered and said to them, "Do you see these great buildings?" not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. Verse 3, that's Mark 13:2. Verse 3, they go over to the Mount of Olives. Verse 4, the disciples say, tell us, when shall these things be? What things? So you see, just like with the Feast of Passover, when Jesus' parents would go up to Jerusalem every year. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. Right? What feast? Well, it's named in the previous verse. It's named in the narrative. And so when the disciples ask, as Matthew, Mark, and Luke are writing down the event, and they said, tell us, when shall these things be? The demonstrative pronoun has to have an antecedent. And you see, Miss Barbara is very intelligent. She is extremely well educated. She has taught classes at the college level. And for her to ignore my arguments on the grammar, this is beneath her level of intelligence. All right? A pronoun must have an antecedent. You cannot start with verse 4, tell us, when shall these things be? What things? You see, you can't just make up some things and stick in it, but that's what she's doing. Tell us, when shall these things, what things? Every stone of the temple will be thrown down. And they said, what is the sign when all these things are about to be done? And that's mellow that is used there by Mark and Luke in that fourth question that Matthew does not include. They asked for a sign. What will be the sign when all of these things are about to be fulfilled, about to be done? And that would be when they would see the city surrounded by armies. That was the sign. When they would see the armies approach, that was their sign. Here's your sign that they were to get out of Dodge. They were out in the country. Don't go back into the town to grab your clothes. Hit the ground running and get out of there immediately. All right? So, this narrative is unified despite a little bit of passage of time from walking from Temple Mount to the Mount of Olives, and in spite of a change of location. Again, I've given you 4 examples, basic grammatical examples in a narrative. All right? And so Miss Barbara must prove contextually, grammatically, especially grammatically, because, again, the demonstrative pronoun must have an antecedent. You can't just start in that verse and then make something up. So again, tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign when all these things are about to be fulfilled? You see, again, it is grammatically and contextually impossible to completely disassociate the disciples' question from Jesus' immediately preceding declaration concerning the dismantling of the temple. That was the whole point of Matthew, Mark, and Luke writing the narrative the way they did. There is not one syllable of a hint that what Jesus was saying to Peter, James, John, and Andrew, that it would not be experienced during their lifetime. And how ridiculous it is to assert that Jesus tells them, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, watch and be ready. When you see these things, get out of town, flee to the mountains. All right. So Miss Barbara keeps touting this loud, globally visible return of Christ, and because no patristic has ever recorded her perception of the eschaton, then she insists that it must still be future. But that is circular reasoning, folks. You see, Miss Barb assumes that her version of the eschaton is accurate without having to prove it. She just reposts the same verses over and over and over and over again and proclaims it hasn't happened yet because her perception of those passages has not occurred yet. Now, I made the statement to her in a comment field. If you are not watching my videos, then you are ignoring all of my arguments. She responded to that by saying, that is a logical fallacy and false. That argument begins with one true premise, one false premise, and a false conclusion. Okay, folks, not to be snarky here, if it begins with the true premise of you are not watching my videos, then how, pray tell, can it be false, a false premise, for me to say that she's ignoring my arguments? We're talking about the arguments I'm making in my videos. I keep telling her, watch the video. I'm answering your questions. I'm providing the evidence you're seeking. So therefore, if you're not watching my videos, you're ignoring all of my arguments and my evidence. So that is not a false premise, and it is not a false conclusion. I mean, she just admitted she's not watching my videos because she said the argument begins with one true premise. She's not watching my videos. All right, she goes on and says, your suggestions of circular reasoning and straw man diversions by me asking you over and over and over and over and over and over to please consider the facts given by our Lord Jesus' own words on his own second coming, as he stated plainly and simply in Mark, Matthew, and 1 Thessalonians 4. Okay. Do you see what she did there? You see, I've accused her of using straw man diversions. I've done that. Guilty. I've accused her of using circular reasoning. So she says, your suggestions of circular reasoning and straw man diversions, and then she defines that by me asking you, that's another straw man. I didn't say, I never even hinted at the idea that her quoting Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and 1 Thessalonians 4, and Revelation, whatever, was a straw man or circular. That's not what I said. Not even close. So she's addressing her circular reasoning and straw man diversions by creating a straw man. Again, that is typical behavior of futurists. Okay. Her circular reasoning is she quotes Acts 1:11. And she says, see there, it hasn't happened yet. No. Your perception of that hasn't happened. It never will. She's assuming what she must prove. That's why I said that, and again, this is typical behavior, mindset of futurists. They believe that whatever falls out of their mouth or comes off the end of their fingers, that is truth, without having to exegete anything to prove anything. Her just quoting these passages and then saying, well, it hasn't happened yet, that is not an argument. Again, she's ignoring all of my arguments. Now, I have already refuted the global aspect of her assertion by using, John 14:23, where Jesus answered the question of Judas, Lord, how is it that you will manifest yourself to us and not to the world? Not to the world. Jesus said, if a man loves me, he'll keep my commandments. My Father will love him, and we will come and make our abode with him. That's not global, folks, because Jesus is answering the question, how will you manifest yourself to us and not to the world? I mean, that takes professionally educated help to misunderstand. I have already refuted the bodily visible return of the Lord in my thorough exegesis of Acts 1, 9 through 11, not just part of verse 11, as well as Revelation 1 and verse 7. I have refuted her misunderstanding on the timing of Revelation because, again, verse 1 of chapter 1 says that these are things which must shortly take place. Then in verse 19, Jesus tells John, write down these things in a book. Write down the things that you have seen, past tense, the things that are present tense, and the things that are about to occur after these things. Now, Miss Barbara has tried to respond to that by saying, well, the things that are, he's supposed to write and send that to the 7 churches. And the things that are following that, well, that's future and even into our future. But you see, again, I have debunked that time after time after time with the grammar. The grammar will not allow the insertion of a 2,000-year gap. Jesus told John to write down the things that are about to occur after these things that are already occurring. It would be the things that are about to occur sequentially. Not a humongous gap. Homily genesia meditata. The things that are about to occur after these things. And then Revelation 7 and verse 14 in particular, where the great multitude there, standing alongside the 144,000, who in chapter 14, verse 4, John calls first fruit. They are first fruit, not last fruit. You see, Miss Barbara projects that into the future. That'll be 144,000 of some group in our future. Well, then they won't be first, because these were converts out of the 12 tribes of Israel. They were the first converts out of the 12 tribes of Israel. There is no other time frame in the history of the planet that element can apply to than first century. During the apostles' ministry, of when Israel was turning to the Lord, the veil was being taken away, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, which is also taken from Isaiah 25, by the way. So, they were first fruit, and standing alongside the first fruit was the innumerable multitude. And the angel tells John that this multitude is comprised of those who are coming out of the great tribulation. Now, folks, tell me why John through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, would write in present tense language that multitude standing there with those first Jewish converts was comprised of those who were coming out of the Great Tribulation. I mean, how much more confusing could that be written if that was something that was to occur thousands and thousands of years in John's future? Remember, he's sending this to the 7 churches of Asia. What scintilla of any coherence would that have? Any reference would that have to the 7 churches of Asia in the 1st century if that was a prediction of something thousands of years in the future? See how ridiculous? Again, the grammar. Miss Barbara is ignoring my arguments and the grammar. And again, she's too intelligent to do that. Again, what is her response? Total disregard. Well, except for saying that my arguments are a gnat, which she later defined as minor. Try to smooth that over just a little bit. And that's compared to her blue whale size arguments. So again, folks, anyone who can see through a ladder realizes that is not a valid rebuttal. It is merely a dismissive deflection. And Miss Barb is intelligent enough to know that what she's peddling wouldn't stand in a formal public debate. Again, she is very well educated, has taught classes at the college level. So for her to simply dismiss and ignore all of this grammatical evidence that I keep presenting, that is dishonest on her part. She makes no effort to explain why that I'm wrong on the grammar. She just denigrates my arguments and dismisses them, apparently trusting that you are not smart enough to see the difference. And that is an attitude of futurists that has always just burned me up. All right, now, again, we come back to her claim of dual prophecy. She says, every stone of the temple will be thrown down, not one stone left upon another. That's AD 70. Okay, check. We agree on that. But then this is dual prophecy. That the Olivet Discourse is dual prophecy. But she gives this example, Isaiah 7 and verse 14. We're going to look at that. Isaiah 7 and verse 14, she says, and I quote, the Olivet Discourse is a dual prophecy, just like they will call his name Immanuel. Isaiah 7, 14 through 18, Matthew 1, 23, is a dual prophecy of 2 different boys over 700 years apart. The Olivet Discourse briefly describes the AD 70 fall of Jerusalem and the future fall of Jerusalem, also described in Zechariah 14:15 with Jesus' second coming. All right, so the assertion is made, the Olivet Discourse is a dual prophecy, just like, not similar, just like what she assumes is a dual prophecy in Isaiah 7 of 2 different boys 700 years apart. Well, that's, even if that were true, that's still a far cry from 2,000 years, but I digress. Let's look at this. Okay, let's begin at verse 10. Moreover, the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, saying, ask a sign for yourself from the Lord. Now notice that. Ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Ask it either in the depth or in the height above. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. Then he said, hear now, O house of David. Is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will you weary my God also? Now watch. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Immanuel. All right, so the first the first thing I want you to see is the pronoun you. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Who? The house of David. All right. And that sign would be, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and call his name Immanuel. Okay. So, where's the beef? Where's the two boys born 700 years apart that were both born of a virgin and they were both named Immanuel? Where is it? Miss Barb, I challenge you and I demand that you answer this question. I challenge you to show us, show me, show your audience, show my audience where there is another Immanuel, a son born of a virgin. It couldn't be Isaiah. It couldn't be Isaiah's wife. Obviously, it's not Isaiah. It could not be Isaiah's wife because she would not be a virgin. It could not be Ahaz's wife because at this point in time, Ahaz, his son Hezekiah, is approximately 13 years old. It could not be the boy that is born in the next chapter to Isaiah. Apparently it's to Isaiah. I used to think it was to Ahaz, but I believe it's to Isaiah. Then I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. And the Lord said to me, call his name Maher Shalal Hazbaz. Again, forgive the pronunciation there. So even if you could prove, which you can't, even if you could prove that this prophetess was a virgin and bore a son, the son born was not named Immanuel. See the problem? So again, don't let me down on this, Miss Barbara. Don't ignore this. This is your doctrine. This is your argument. You must prove it. You can't just say something. All right? And so the bottom line is this is a huge blunder for someone as well educated as Barbara. And so her assertion of dual prophecy goes down in flames. Dual prophecy would require two fulfillments for the same prophecy, which that's what she's arguing with Isaiah 7:14. So that's why I'm confounded at how the remainder of the Olivet Discourse can be a dual prophecy. I mean, her whole point in dividing it is to say, and she said that verses 1 and 2 is a brief description of 80-70. So that would mean the rest of it does not pertain to 80-70. So how could it be a dual prophecy just like Isaiah 7:4? This is saturated in self-contradictions. There's no such thing as dual fulfillment for the same prophecy, because that redefines the term fulfillment. If it's fulfilled, then it's filled full. And if it's not filled full, then it's not fulfilled. To suggest that something can be filled full twice, dual, is an astounding leap into the abyss of absurdity, and it defies all logic and common sense. All right, now, Miss Barb asserts that Revelation 1 and verse 7 is treated as the controlling theme of Revelation. Well, I certainly don't disagree with that statement. So then how can you make this assertion while denying that verse 1's these things which must shortly take place is not likewise a controlling theme? Why? Why not? So I have another question for you, Miss Barbara. Pay attention. Were the constituent elements of Revelation 1:7, he is coming with clouds, and every eye will see him, all the tribes of the land shall mourn, are those constituent elements among the things which must shortly take place of Revelation 1:1? If not, what grammatical and or contextual marker divides the things which must shortly take place into separate categories, one which was imminent and one which is thousands of years distant? All right. So to restate one of my arguments, Daniel 7:13 is the only prophecy of the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven for judgment. Jesus quotes verbatim from Daniel 7:13 in Matthew 24:30 and says all, not some. And the disciples' question was, when shall all these things be? What shall be the sign when all these things are about to be fulfilled? And Jesus said, truly I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all these things be fulfilled. All what things? Well, he had just quoted from Daniel 7:13 and Isaiah 27, and I forgot the verse, about the great trumpet, and the great tribulation from Daniel 7, and the abomination of Daniel's desolation, the abomination of desolation from Daniel 12. All right. So he has saturated the Olivet Discourse with Daniel's prophecies. He even named Daniel the prophet. And he said, all these things will be fulfilled before this generation passes away. Jesus also appropriated that prophecy, Daniel 7, in Matthew 16:27 and 28, and says, there's some standing here that'll not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Jesus appropriated that prophecy again in Matthew 26:64 and told Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of God and coming in the clouds of heaven. So every time that we have record of that Jesus appropriated or quoted from Daniel 7, he placed the fulfillment of all things during the lifetime of the people to whom he was speaking to. And then we have Miss Barbara's bizarre assertion that the Great Tribulation is not only in our future, but is going to be a mass murdering of the great multitude that no one could count. Again, I told you that she has some unique posits. And that one is a doozy. So again, this is the second of her utterly bizarre assertions, which are unique to her, which is why we are dedicating this portion of our debunking series specifically to her. And I have demonstrated from the grammar why this assertion is false. Okay? Because, again, John was writing. As he was writing, he said the great multitude was comprised, he was told, was comprised of those who are coming out of the great tribulation. So that is just a complete farce. And so Miss Barb keeps touting the idea that the Battle of Armageddon is yet in our future and that it's going to be one of those loud events with this huge, great earthquake, and that nothing like this has ever been recorded in history, and she demands that I give her a list of eyewitnesses, names, and so forth. And so we are going to look at a couple of things here for the evidence. And so Revelation 16 then is John's record here of the Battle of Armageddon. All right, now I want you to notice right here in verse 18, there were noises and thunderings and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such a mighty and great earthquake as had not occurred since men were on the earth. So this is what Miss Barb says. This has never happened. This has never been recorded. And she demands evidence, eyewitnesses. So let's look right here at Josephus. But the shame that would attend them in case they returned without doing anything at all so far overcame that their repentance, that they lay all night before the wall, though in a very bad encampment. For there broke out a prodigious storm in the night, with the utmost violence and very strong winds, with largest showers of rain, with continued lightnings, terrible thunderings. Now notice this. And amazing concussions and bellowings of the earth that was in an earthquake. Do you see that? Josephus has just recorded that this was the worst storm and earthquake that's ever been. These things were a manifest indication that some destruction was coming upon men when the system of the world was put into this disorder, and anyone would guess that these wonders foreshadowed some grand calamities that were coming. All right, let's keep going. Notice that verse 19 says, "Now the great city was divided into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon was remembered before God to give her the cup of wine of the fierceness of his wrath." Notice here, it so happened that the sedition at Jerusalem was revived and parted into three factions, and that one faction fought against the other, which partition in such evil cases may be said to be a good thing in the effect of divine justice. Let's read verse 21. "And great hail from heaven fell upon men, each hailstone about the weight of a talent. Men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, since that plague was exceedingly great." All right, notice here, the engines that all the legions had ready, prepared for them, were admirably contrived, but still more extraordinary ones belonged to the 10th Legion. Those that threw darts and those that threw stones were more forcible and larger than the rest, by which they not only repelled the excursions of the Jews, but drove those away that were upon the walls also. Now the stones that were cast were the weight of a talent. About the weight of a talent. And were carried 2 furlongs and further. The blow they gave was no way to be sustained, not only by those that stood first in the way, but by those that were beyond them for a great space. As for the Jews, they at first watched the coming of the stone, for it was white, of a white color, and could therefore not only be perceived by the great noise it made, but could be seen also before it came by its brightness. Accordingly, the watchmen that sat upon the towers gave them notice when the engine was let go, and the stone came from it, and cried out aloud in their own country language, "The stone cometh." So, there you have the eyewitness evidence and historic record of the fulfillment, that at least that fits perfectly with what John is describing in his vision of this Battle of Armageddon. Yeah. Okay, so in our next installment, we are going to address 1 Thessalonians 4. Now, Miss Barb keeps saying verse 15 and following. We're going to back up just a little bit because that's not the whole story. And I'm going to tell you the rest of the story, good Lord willing, and time to spare. All right, so I know this has gone a little bit long. I want to thank you for your time and watching this. And again, Miss Barb, I'm expecting answers to my arguments this time. And so until our next scheduled lesson, I pray that God will bless you richly in your study of His divine word. Wherever you're at, folks, hope you have a blessed day, evening, night, whatever the case may be, in your neck of the woods. And so thank you so much for your time.